Welcome to Changemakers for a Free Agenda, an intersectional panel discussion featuring organizers, artists, legislators, and allies on the ground working to promote legislation that ensures a Texas where we are free to choose, free to act, free to dream, and free to envision a future of prosperity. Guided by intersectional core values rooted in gender justice, we envision a future where all young leaders of color can thrive. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Texas State Representative Donna Howard, Chair of the Texas House Women's Health Caucus and Changemaker Champion. Hi, Donna.
Hi, glad to be here.
Emmett Schelling, Executive Director at Transgender Education Network of Texas and member of our Deeds Not Words Board of Directors. Hi, Emmett.
Hi there. Thanks so much for including me on this great discussion.
Amber Mills, Austin Advocacy Organizer at Move Texas. Hi, Amber.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And Irma Garcia, Client Services Manager at Jane's Due Process and a Sexual Health Educator at Dirty South Sex Ed. Together, we will talk about the current legislative sessions in Texas, the threats and opportunities we face as a movement, and ways in which young changemakers can be involved by organizing in their communities and uplifting these issues of our free agenda. So, Rep. Howard, we're going to start with you. As you know, our free agenda stands for freedom from violence, reproductive autonomy, economic opportunity, and equitable representation. As one of our Changemaker legislative champions, are there any specific proactive bills that align with the free agenda that stand out to you this legislative session? And have you filed any of these bills this session?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion, and I'm so grateful to all the people who are working so hard to make sure that we achieve the goals that you have expressed. And yes, despite the fact that there's a lot of bad legislation, as there always is, that we're having to fight back against, there are some good proactive pieces of legislation, and I want to just respond to a few of those things and let you know about some of them. And I think one of the main things that I see us working on now is to try to remove some of those systemic barriers that are keeping people from fully participating, especially young Texans and especially those of color and those with gender identity that does not conform to what the legislature has typically looked at. So, you know, we're moving forward, and there's a lot of legislation to address this. So let me mention a few of these things. And first off, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Medicaid expansion, because certainly we have the highest rate and number of uninsured in the nation. And the COVID experience has only exacerbated that. And we can't truly have equity here unless we have everybody having access. And so we've got a lot of bills that are addressing that. We certainly are looking a lot more too, when we're talking about freedom from violence. The George Floyd Act is a significant piece of legislation that is moving through, and I'm hopeful will be able to pass. And of course, that's addressing a lot about the injustices of how law enforcement is not really there for everyone. And we want to make sure that everyone feels safe and that their safety is just as important as everyone else's. Representative Collier has legislation to expand the definition of consent with sexual assault to where they know that the person's intoxicated, that they've withdrawn consent, or that they're a caregiver of that person, and so they're in a vulnerable position and are taking advantage of them. That would be part of the definition now of sexual assault. I have a piece of legislation that is on trauma-informed interviews. And what this does, listening to survivors and those that are advocates in the field, no polygraph test would be able to be administered. You would have to have an advocate present for the interview with the police, just as you do can have an advocate for the forensic exam. And speaking of the forensic exam, would also ensure that you have a right to a forensics exam if you want one. There's been some instances where these have been denied, so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. We've got other bills that are reflective of recommendations that came out of the Sexual Assault Survivors Task Force that I and Victoria Niave are filing. Reproductive autonomy. Clearly, there's a lot of stuff we need to do there and more legislation. I am carrying an omnibus bill that is referred to as the Abortion is Healthcare Act, which is seeking to repeal all of the oppressive pieces of legislation that have occurred previously. So, I would like to say that's going to go through. That's going to be a real challenge, but we want to just keep making sure people are aware of how this is obstructing access to healthcare for those that are seeking abortions. And then just let me real quickly mention equitable representation. There's a lot of different pieces of legislation depending on how you want to define that. But certainly when we're talking about our transgender community, there are several pieces of legislation. Ron Reynolds has one to create a task force to look at the legal and societal barriers that are preventing equality for our Texans who are transgender. A bill that would be looking at voting to ensure that that our transgender community has access to voting without any kind of obstruction there. Certainly, Sinfronia Thompson, who's been around forever fighting for these issues, has a bill for equal pay for equal work that we want to keep working on. And I guess the last one I'll mention, and I feel like I'm going on and I'm sorry, but there's a lot to talk about here, is a bill to eliminate the sales tax on feminine hygiene products, which is a discriminatory practice in and of itself. And the fact is that even though this doesn't remove all the costs, it's at least a statement that we're not going to have tax-free shampoo and tax-free baked goods you eat with a fork without looking at the medical necessities that women and those who menstruate for many, many years of their lives. This is a medical necessity, and it is a discriminatory sales tax that we want to get rid of. And there's a lot of bipartisan support for that, actually. So I'm pretty excited about the possibilities. And there's more I could talk about, but I'll stop there and let others have a chance to say something.
So Emmett, we know that session after session, the rights of LGBTQ Texans are under attack. As a fierce advocate for this community, how do you see the legislative priorities outlined in the free agenda dismantling the systematic oppression and discrimination that everyday LGBTQ Texans face?
The free agenda, what I love about it, right, is when you look at the four main tenets, what we're talking about, right? These should be common sense, agenda items for every single Texan. Like this, the fact that it's being framed and portrayed as just this kind of special sort of liberal, like wackadoo, like far idea, it is really asinine to me, right? When we're talking about having a freedom from violence, LGBTQ people, we know, are disproportionately affected by that, especially trans people. And then when you get into it, BIPOC trans people, to understand that the well-being of somebody who is trans in Texas is connected inherently to the well-being of somebody who's cisgender, because it's this just fundamental idea that I just worry, right, that we've strayed so far in the state, being the friendship state, and having a reputation and having something that's so foundational to us, right, caring about one another, caring about our neighbors. When we talk about like LGBTQ rights or trans rights, this idea that it's special, like we're asking for special things, we're asking for special privileges, is just simply untrue. And knowing that the majority of Texans, again, support LGBTQ people having a fundamental shared right to like being protected from being terminated from their job simply for being who we are, who we love, and being removed from our housing simply for those facts. And you see refused service, and it's just this pattern, right, of kind of piecemeal, like who gets full autonomy over themselves and who does not. And where we see that tie-in, is so clear to how it comes back to the fight for reproductive autonomy, for economic opportunity, for representation that really reflects us, in a state that, is as diverse in so many ways as Texas is. The need, right, for more women to like come in power. I think one of the things that always sticks out to me, right, when we're having these discussions is I'm often the lone man out, literally. and I will say, like, I greatly benefit. I don't know, if it's a secret at this point, or it's like, yeah, like this is a really good like group to be with, women and femmes, because I'm always so in awe and continue to learn and continue to benefit so deeply, and grateful for, all of that investment and energy, and, wonderful women and powerful women of Texas here.
Absolutely, Emma. You hit the nail on the head. We're talking about fundamental basic rights for everyone. And I don't even know why, it continues to be an issue or a fight. So we appreciate all that you do in that regard. So Amber, I'm going to ask you a question. Our free agenda acknowledges the importance of reflecting the increasing diversity of Texas, from who votes to who governs. We know that the path to shifting the balance of power in Texas begins and ends with increasing the civic engagement and voter participation of the young voices who have been intentionally silenced and excluded from decision-making conversations and electoral outcomes. What do you see as the greatest threat this legislative session to our voting rights, particularly the rights of young voters of color? What impact will the redistricting process have in our elections for years to come?
There have been several anti-voter bills filed this session that are obviously a really big threat to voters and voting rights, but there are two that stand out the most, which are SB 7 and HB 6. And both of these bills were filed just before the deadline to introduce bills. Both are attempts to make voting harder in Texas, which is already one of the most restrictive states in the country and has a long history of voter suppression. So several of the provisions in these bills were written to discourage voters of color, especially young voters of color, from casting a ballot. And they also are attempts to go back on several of the pro-voter reforms that counties did in 2020. Some of the provisions include things like restricting early voting days and hours, which is a direct attack on the 24-hour voting in Harris County. Other things are limiting access for mail-in ballots, threatening criminalization over really small and honest mistakes. And that really just like touches the surface of those. So really the narrative that's pushing these bills forward is around election integrity and election security, which we know they're not even questioning the legitimacy of the elections they themselves won. And to really state it simply, the goal is to keep us silent. It's to make the process more difficult and harder to navigate, because they know that we are starting to make up the larger percentage of eligible voters, and that's a threat to them. For the impact on redistricting, it definitely will have a large and noticeable consequences on elections for the next 10 years. And that's going to be entirely because of these strangely drawn lines. The fact is that population data shows that Texas is growing younger and more diverse, which means that, like I said, the electorate composition is shifting. So in order to keep power in the hands of a few older white men, the maps are going to be drawn to either break up minority communities or to pack them all into a few districts where they're okay with losing them, because it really doesn't matter as much because they have the rest of the state. And what's another part that's really bad about this is that the process is being done almost completely behind doors. And it's a process that has the ability to cement political power for the next 10 years. So there's not only a lack of transparency there is a lack of accountability, which has already been brought up in this conversation as well. The third and kind of final aspect that I want to touch on that's like really unfortunate with this process is that it will directly impact young Texans probably the most, because the way the districts are drawn can severely limit the balance of power, not only between political parties, but across generations. So that basically means that it's going to be even longer before we have leadership that looks and thinks like us.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, you are so right. Unfortunately, in this session alone, we have seen numerous anti-choice bills filed by anti-abortion extremists. These dangerous bills will go as far as to criminalize and outright ban our right to abortion in Texas. What is a common misconception about abortion and our reproductive rights that you have encountered this legislative session, and how can we shift a pro-life narrative to an abortion-forward one?
The popular concern from those that oppose teen access to contraception and or sex ed is usually that they fear teens are going to become more sexually active. And while there isn't any evidence to suggest that, rather that if they don't have any access to contraception or anything, they're still going to have sex, but instead they're just going to have sex without any contraception whatsoever.
Right.
And usually the withdrawal method is used, and as we all know, that's not as effective. So that's usually the main thing that we hear on the ground from a lot of folks who are anti-choice and against a lot of comprehensive sex ed bills.
And so what have you encountered this legislative session? Like what bills are you seeing? What do you think that, the most, misconception about these bills?
Yeah, so at the moment, we are seeing folks talking about the right definition of consent, which is pretty interesting because we would assume that consent is something that is fairly known amongst a lot of people, but that tends to be an issue of discussion. And then there are two sex ed bills currently. There's HB 972, which is talking about teaching healthy relationships, and then HB 1038, which is meant to remove anti-LGBTQ language from the state statute, which currently in Texas, it says that any homosexual conduct is illegal. So seeing those bills introduced and having folks talking about that is a great way to dispel stigma, but also you do have folks talking about how it will promote teens to have sex and all of that. So it kind of goes back to what I originally said about that anti-choice language that folks have around teens where they don't have autonomy when it comes to their bodies. Right. And then from there, it kind of trickles onto the bills that are surrounding abortion and contraception, because then you have the bills that are being introduced about parental consent laws, where such as My Body, My Future. That one is to get rid of the parental consent statute from that bill so that teens can actually consent to their own birth control without having to involve a parent or get parental consent. Because like the rest of us, they also want confidentiality and to be able to act autonomously for their sexual and reproductive health care. So those things that I mentioned tend to intersect a lot with these bills that talk about sex ed and abortion and contraception.
As someone who came of age before Roe v. Wade, I have the perspective of what it was like before having autonomy over one's own body and not being able to control the things that could happen, like getting pregnant, that would dictate the rest of your life if you had no other options. And so I think that it's still hard for some people, especially those maybe who weren't around at the time that I was, to recognize what an extreme difference it is when women are able to, and those that have babies are able to actually decide if and when they want to, and control what happens with their own bodies so that they have educational and economic opportunities that they might not otherwise have. I can tell you as a nurse that health-wise, it's one of the most significant public health events of the last century was family planning, which allowed the spacing of pregnancies. And we saw a decrease in maternal and infant mortality as a result of that. This is a public health issue, as well as an educational and economic opportunity issue. And it's not the I think what some of my colleagues think is that it's a frivolous, oh, I don't care, I'm just going to do this. No, this is part of an entire package of options available that are medically safe, that are healthcare, that are decisions that are made between the person seeking the abortion and their healthcare provider. And if we don't have that in place, I can guarantee you there will still be abortions. They will be unsafe. And we know prior to Roe v. Wade about the many deaths that occurred as a result. Not to mention all those other opportunities that I just referred to. So I don't know how to get that across sometimes to my colleagues, but I think that there's this lack of understanding of not having control over your own life and destiny if you don't have control over your own body. So if I could get that across, that would be something I would really want to see happen.
Well, we appreciate you taking on that challenge and continuing the conversation in that regard. What do you see as the greatest threat and biggest opportunity this legislative session?
Starting with a threat, we did not get to meet during the interim like we normally do to do our homework and have visits with advocates about legislation so we could get prepared. Because of COVID and the rules that we have, we weren't able to have virtual hearings even. So we've started the session off kind of on an uneven footing without having a lot of the homework done, a very compressed session, a lot of things happening real quickly. And we're already halfway through the session, and it's going to come like a brick wall here pretty quickly. Lots to get passed, and we have barely met on the House floor at all. We haven't even considered any bills on the floor yet. So that's been an obstacle. The budget is always an obstacle in trying to figure out how we're going to make that work. And then certainly we had a week off because of the winter freeze. And now that's kind of sucking the oxygen out of the room too. We're so focused now on what needs to be done to correct the electric grid that it's getting in the way of everything else. On a positive note though, it may get in the way of some of the bad legislation that we don't want to see passed. So that's one of those double-edged swords. It could be an opportunity actually. And elections matter. This last election, though we didn't in the House lose the number of Democrats that we had, we did actually not increase the numbers that we had been anticipating. So we came into this session with a little bit of being behind, if you will, and also giving the other side kind of a sense of, well, we've got the power here. And with the SCOTUS appointments, with the Supreme Court appointments that occurred, there is a momentum that is to push for some things just to get them out the door into the Supreme Court that we don't want to see in terms of eroding our reproductive rights. So that's kind of in the way. Opportunities, it's harder for me to get there right now with what we're dealing with. But again, I do think that elections matter, obviously, and we have a change in administration in the White House. And that's going to help us with a lot of things that were in the way before when we didn't have that kind of support. And I think the electorate is very engaged right now because they've had to deal with COVID, because they've had to deal with the electricity grid going down, because they're having to deal with a sense of not trusting that government is going to do what needs to be done for them. And they're kind of trying to take control again, which maybe is a very good thing here. And so I see opportunities because of engagement and paying attention to things and wanting to be involved and make sure that government is accountable, which I think a lot of people are thinking we're not. So I'm hopeful that that's an opportunity too for like-minded people. And you know, the majority of Texans support the agenda that you have before you. They support freedom and equity, and they support having access to reproductive health care and abortions. So we're on the side of the majority here. And so if we have more people speaking up and holding us accountable, let's use that opportunity to get some things done.
No, I'll definitely follow up on the opportunities, because I think she was spot on with that. Is even though there's a lot of noise, especially online with social media and everything right now with climate, COVID, everything, people are more engaged than they probably ever have been. They have more knowledge about the process because there are organizations that are like feeding that information to them. So I think that is a really strong and unique opportunity for us to focus on and leverage to really mobilize people and continue building a base of people that care about these issues. As far as threats, well, while we do have some wonderful leaders like Rep. Howard, I think we have a lot that have shown that they don't actually care necessarily about the things that a lot of us do care about. And so I think that's just going to be one of those uphill battles, really pushing back against the things they're pushing for.
I'm going to go ahead and echo what a lot of these panelists said. I personally believe that's one of the biggest threats is SRJ 25, which is talking about getting rid of, of banning abortion completely. While we don't really believe that that is going to happen, it's still going to promote anti-choice stigma. It's going to feed into that, and it is going to make folks fear seeking abortion care because not everyone knows what's happening. And like even before the pandemic happened, people weren't 100% sure if abortion was legal in Texas or not. So this is going to keep adding into that, and that is going to have folks not seek abortion care when they are wanting it. So that is what I believe would be one of the biggest threats at the moment.
And what about opportunities? What are you seeing in the legislative session as a win for us?
Yeah, so the My Body, My Future bill, HB 3369, is the first bill that has ever been introduced to repeal parental consent when it comes to birth control since 1998. So that is huge. And even if it doesn't happen, it's just getting that conversation started. That's a big deal. And it makes folks want to get involved and build a movement. And we are already seeing young people getting more involved in the session and also calling their senators or state representatives. So all of that is amazing. And it actually pumps us up for the next session and seeing what improvements we can do next time. So that is one of my, that is what I believe is one of the biggest opportunities.
Absolutely. I think previously where we've seen from 2017 with the bathroom bill on where just as Representative Howard said, that unfortunately so many of these legislators are out of touch with the people of Texas. And when they're challenged with that, right, we're in hordes where we're seeing, you know, organizations like Move, like Engage Young People, organizations like Deeds, organizations like 10, bringing out trans folks, you know, our families, the people, clergy, people who know, love, and are appalled, right, by the amount of energy that we're putting into this, when we know that there's so many things that our legislative body can be doing to really benefit the state and really abide by the constituency in their wishes and wanting to continue to make Texas this amazing place to live and work and grow and have a family and remain in. And the unfortunate reality of that is due to agendas that are just out of touch with Texans. This is why we continue to see what people, I think, get frustrated in the gridlock of like what the legislative session sometimes feels like. But I'm so grateful too for Rep. Howard pointing out and talking about the good things, because I think one of the things that I feel grateful for in doing the work that I do is sometimes there's, when you just have to rely on the media, you just have to rely sometimes on external like points of view. We've seen that internal change, right? Where we've seen legislators who you never would have thought would have, made a specific stance to say, like, we're not here to like gay bash, we're not here to disrespect, parents that are just showing up for their trans kids. And even though, their votes necessarily aren't with us and we need that to happen, right? There's that slow evolution and movement where we see the people continually show up, the people of Texas continually show up, and the constituency shows up to reinforce exactly what, Representative Howard said.
Thank you, Emmett, for that. So now that all of you are kind of have a better understanding about our free agenda, do any of the free agenda issues define your work more so than others? Do they intersect? If so, why or why not? Rep. Howard, I'll start with you.
As chair of the Women's Health Caucus, obviously, and as one who has worked on these issues for many, many years, that obviously resonates with me and with what I do. But the intersectionality, I think, that occurs with ensuring that all people have access and opportunities without any barriers, it has always also been extremely important to me. And as I've learned more and more as a white person about people of color and how the institutions have worked against them. And, I admit that I've had to have my consciousness raised. I did not see a lot of these things. And so I feel more of an imperative now to also integrate what I'm doing with so-called women's healthcare with making sure that we are creating systems that recognize the diversity among us and ensure that all have the same potential outcomes. One of the things that we're also really working on here this time at the legislature is to recreate the Office of Minority Health, or it's been called other things too, but bottom line, we unfortunately defunded that in 2017 unnecessarily, behind closed doors with us not knowing about it. And we've seen the detriment in COVID, which has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. And perhaps if that office had been in place, there would have been somebody at the table addressing that. We all also know, as has been mentioned before, I think by Emmett, the maternal morbidity and mortality issue. This obviously has been disproportionately impacting people of color as well. And we already knew that. There's lots of others, though, other illnesses, and we've seen how people don't have access to vaccines. The list goes on and on. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is there's several aspects to the free agenda that intersect and that are part of what I am so privileged to be able to work on. And just really grateful too for all of y'all's groups here and the advocacy that you do. you know, I'm thinking about this, how important it is when I listen to y'all speak, how important it is that these organizations exist. You don't have to do this by yourself. There are people that are looking for the same kind of outcomes who are doing the work to ensure that you know what the legislation is, when you need to chime in. You don't have to understand how all of that happens, and you don't have to follow it and do all that work yourself. There are people who will do it for you, with you, and then you can have coalitions of all these different groups who work together, and that is dynamic. And that is how you can get truly engaged. And so I'm just really impressed with what all of y'all are doing, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Rep. Howard. Amber, I'll pass the question to you.
Yeah, my work is definitely very heavily focused on voting rights, but as Representative Howard said, they absolutely intersect. Voting rights are women's issues. They're racial and climate justice issues, because without that equal access and opportunity, our leadership is not going to be representative of the population, and therefore policy around these issues won't be either. So it all hits each other at some point. And in my opinion, it kind of starts with voting. And that's where we can really do the most work to start pushing us in the right direction. And then comes those policy actions. And that takes our elected officials to listen to what we want.
Absolutely. Emmett, I'll pass the question to you.
Yeah, you know, I think as Amber so eloquently highlighted, that really it comes down to understanding the power of voting, right? And how that all connects. And I think what has been so beautiful about the free agenda in the way that it connects and really frames it to make it understandable and accessible, how this all comes about. And you know, I think all of these issues are incredibly important. And you know, in terms of, I'm an immigrant, and so even for folks who are like, well, what does that look like for immigrants who can't vote, is also knowing that there's a responsibility, you know, even more so a burden, right, on people to exercise their vote for those folks that can't, to put your principles, to put your heart into understanding how to exercise and to compel you, right, to engage in voting. And then, you know, looking through the free agenda and understanding how that links so deeply and connects. One of the things that stuck out to me from Representative Howard, right, was talking about minority health issues. And as we've been talking about it, you know, is one of the things that sticks out to me so much is that we're really not the minority. And I think that is the like fear, right? And like to think that like you know, gender issues should be minority issues as opposed to Texan issues is really kind of where we see that disconnect of unfortunately where some of the leadership, you know, that I think Amber said old white men, right, who have like lost touch with Texas, with who they're serving, who put them in those offices, is really reflected, right, when you're talking about minority health and you're talking about, well, okay, that encompasses women, it encompasses you know, BIPOC people, it encompasses, you know, all these different folks. When we put us together to understand that we are Texas, right? We are the reflection of this state. We are not going to settle for being less than or being treated that way by our leadership. And I think that is the thing that I really took away from the free agenda, is that this is emphatically stating we're not going to be sidelined, we're not going to be silenced, we're not going to accept anything less than what we know we deserve in economic opportunity and reproductive autonomy, the ability to have control over our own bodies and our own health. That is a simple, fundamental thing that it should not be questioned. You know, of freedom from violence, to not be targeted for who we are or who we love in a state as large as Texas, with as much diversity as we talked about. And you know what that then looks like with voting and equitable representation. Who do we see then reflected by our ability to vote, to put people in those offices that reflect us, to lead us?
Actually, all of those values intersect and align with my work at JDP. Young people in Texas, again, seek to act autonomously and have a confidential process whenever they're seeking sexual and reproductive health care. So that in and of itself covers like the first three values. And then as we center them in our work, that is also part of creating that equitable representation as they themselves make their voices heard.
So we have many members in our D's Not Words chapters and young changemakers across the state who want to get more involved in advocating for these issues. What are ways that our youth can get involved to support you and our larger movement work? So Amber, I can start with you.
Yeah, I definitely think the biggest thing is just to go back to social media. Follow Move Texas, sorry, on Twitter and Instagram. Their handles are the same, move_Texas. We are constantly sharing out like fun graphics that kind of tell you what's going on with calls to action. So I think that's the biggest way to support us now, especially still in the pandemic, is just sharing out that information, educating your friends and family, and then taking actions. Like when we, for instance, right now we have a petition against those bills that I just mentioned. And then we're also planning to do some online actions around those. So really just trying to participate and plug in wherever you can. That's the biggest way to support us.
So at James Due Process, young people are who we center. So we can, they can actually go on our website and sign up to get involved in the movement. That's all about the legislative session. So yeah, just going on our website, it'll direct everyone there. But we are already having folks creating TikToks for the session, and it's actually making it a big deal. Like folks like I believe Bustle wrote about our young people who have been creating these TikToks to talk about my body, my future, to talk about contraception and sex ed. So all of those things are amazing. So yeah, if young people want to get involved, they can totally contact us.
I'm so excited about the fact that you want to get involved with what happens in advocating at the legislature, and it is critical. Especially now when people, because of COVID, are not able to be as physically present in the Capitol, it's extremely important that you still reach out to your elected officials. And, you know, we're still available to meet by Zoom, which a lot of us are doing. We're still obviously taking phone calls and emails and all of those normal ways we communicate with one another. But I think what I especially like to see happening with young advocates is the social media engagement and bringing a lot of folks together who may not even be aware of what's going on. There's a huge group of people who are young people who are supportive of the elimination of the sales tax on tampons, who have really taken to social media, and they're contacting through social media all of the legislators who are on the committees that will be hearing this legislation and encouraging them to be supportive of it. Legislators want to hear from their own constituents. It's important to reach out to everybody who might be involved, but definitely make sure that you have contacted your own particular elected representatives so that they know that this is something that you care about enough to call them and talk to them about it. And be sure and talk to staff, because we listen to our staff all the time. And when we need to have a refresher of, you know, who talked to us about this, that, or the other, they're the ones that will keep up with that. So it's really good to meet with staff as well. We are having testimony on legislation. You can still come in person. If you want to risk doing that right now, we're getting it. It's a little better now, but we do have in person. And then there's also opportunities now for some virtual testimony. It's invited at this point, but there's also a portal that you could submit testimony through. So there are some options, and we want your voice to be heard. It really does make a difference. I know that there are times when it feels like it's fighting uphill. You come and you talk and you try to advocate for something, and you just have to keep coming back and coming back. But I'll tell you that eventually it can work. And we need you to have your voice to be heard. So please make sure you do come to the Capitol, either in person or virtually, and ensure that we're paying attention to the things that mean something to you, and that are going to make a difference in your lives and the future of Texas. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I think, we've done everything we can at this point to really keep in mind where people are, right, in stages of vaccination, in their own personal, safety, security, in engaging with the legislative process. So social media, you can find us, at Trans Texas on Twitter and Instagram. I am admittedly irrelevant, as my child, who is 21, reminds me, because I struggle to think of even what's what. And you can find us on Facebook and at Transgender Education Network of Texas. And if you go to our website, transtexas.org, you can subscribe for updates, action alerts, things like that. And, throughout session, we're going to be continuing to engage, our supporters, our community. And every Friday, we are doing a Friday Ledge Roundup to kind of give folks a quick snapshot of this is what happened, and this is what maybe potentially is on the horizon, and do all we can, because at this point it's it's such a dangerous time too, right, to allow these huge omnibus voting bills, right? What does that mean at the heart of all of this work, right? If the people of Texas are intentionally silenced and divided. And so really, I think this session, even though I know it's more challenging, right, than we've ever seen it, it's so detrimental to engage and really let your legislators know, if they're doing a great job, like Representative Howard, cheer them on, let her know, hey, we really appreciate your leadership, your fight. And if they're not, let them know too, because that's just as important.
Thank you, Emmett, for that. So that wraps up our conversation. To all the panelists, thank you for your participation and for being partners in our work. A special thank you to all of our sponsors who made this event possible. To learn more about our work and legislative agenda, visit our website, dsnotwords.com, and follow us on our social media platforms. To all the viewers, thank you for creating with us a future where we are free to choose, free to act, and free to dream. We'll see you next time, Changemakers.